Alrighty there, fellow mini painters and lovers of all things Oldhammer related, and welcome to another video from me, Nostalgiahammer Hobbies, where I'm going to be continuing in my journey of building a small 1000 point rapid attack strike force for the Blood Angels for our games in October with Bring About a Wargame. And I'm going to be doing the leader for this force. It might be a little bit of a controversial choice, but I'm still going to go with it. It's going to be this classic model, Chaplain on bike. So let's get to it. A lot of the time it's thought of a bad idea to put your characters on or in vehicles such as transports or bikes, simply because of one lucky hit from your opponent and a decent roll of a 6, the vehicle blows up and that's your character completely dead. However, there are some advantages to having characters on bikes, especially chaplains, which this article back in White Dwarf 208 talks about, such as being able to get the chaplain around a lot more effectively to use his ability to allow Space Marines to re-roll their shaken tests if they fail them. And my plan is to make him a chaplain mighty hero and the leader of my force, which means I'm essentially going to be able to have a leadership 10 leader rocking around the place, allowing the units to re-roll any failed break tests, which could be extremely useful. You also have the ability to do hit and run attacks with bikes as well. So with a chaplain on bike, that gives you quite a hard punching model by itself. And you have him going along with a unit backing him up. That means you've got quite a potent punch. I've also got the plan of adding the Scythe's War Gear card to the bike, which will allow him to do an extra Strength 4 -1 hit when he comes in for a hit and run attack, which I reckon could give them a little bit of extra punch. And then add to that the War Gear card for ablative armour along with it. You'll also be able to mitigate against any of those lucky hits to begin with by ignoring the first penetrating hit, which will help to give him a little bit of survivability whilst he's rocking around the place, hopefully keep him alive long enough to get in there and really cause some damage. Later on in the same issue, they show this army that's designed to be a fast response force. And looking at the list, I've actually got most of the models in this, minus a couple of them. So I'm toying with the idea of potentially doing this army up and doing it for Blood Angels instead of Ultramarines. If that's something you'd like the idea of, pop down in the comments that you'd like it, and I'll give that a whirl. Now that I've explained to you why I'm thinking that a Blood Angels Chaplain might be a good idea, and it's certainly going to be fun to try and do it, I reckon it's time that we put some paint to this model. So, get yourself a fresh cup of tea, and let's get to the painting desk and put some paint to this classic. I can actually remember all the way back when this model was first released, and it really did hit the spot for me. The paint job was absolutely brilliant in the White Dwarf. I really did want one back in the day. Now I've actually got one, I'm going to do my best to imitate this paint job as closely as I can, with slight changes to it. I'm going to do it for Blood Angels instead of Ultramarines, and I'm going to do a couple of different decals. I am also going to do my best to see if I can imitate the banner that's put on there with that pretty decent skull, a Blood Angel symbol instead of an Ultramarines one. And the way I start is by priming it up with High Coat's Matte Black, which is a rattle can primer, and it's pretty damn close to Abaddon Black. From then, the first colour that I use is Uriel Yellow, and I use that for the headlights. And it's best off to start with this one, because then you can pick out the other metal grills and that lot around it, without having to be too fiddly with doing the yellow. Then after I've done the headlights, I'm going to jump along and do the metallics, and for that I'm going to be using Lead Belcher. And we're just going to do that on any of the exhaust pipes, engine parts, anything on the guns that are done in metallics, and anywhere else that you can see that's supposed to be a metallic colour. After that, I'm going to use Sandry Dust for any of the skulls that are on here. And you'll find them if you look around it. There's one on the front of the bike, here in between the headlights. There are a couple dotted around on the fuel tanks as well. There's also the front of his helmet, which has got the skull detailing on there. I'm going to do that bone as well. And there is also the top of his Crozius Arcanum. That I'm also going to do in a Sandry Dust base coat. After that, I'm going to do the skull on top of his banner pole that I've made for it, as well as the scrolls that are on here dotted around. And the pages that's on the book on the back of his bike. For the banner pole, what I did was I took a 25mm length of paperclip and one of the Tyrannid skulls out of the Games Workshop skull kit that you can get at the moment. I drilled a hole where I wanted the banner pole to go, and then just put the banner hole through into it and glued it in place. I have also done the left-hand shoulder pad Xandri dust, ready for having the Evil Sun Scarlet base coat applied to it. And after that, I'm going to do any of the little red areas that are going to be on here, such as this canister that's on the back of his bike. I'm going to pick this out in Mephiston Red. You can also do any of the switches that's on his control panel of the bike red that you'd like. These are purely artistic choice. It's wherever you want, colours you want to do them, you pick them. I'm doing a couple of them red. There's also the little trim on his weapons holster on his hip, doing red as well. After that, I'm going to do any of the brown leathery areas with Mournfang Brown. I'm going to do the front cover of the book with this, ready to be done with the red wash later. As well as his seat, and give that a nice all-over coat of the same colour. I'm also going to do a couple of other areas of different brown colour. And for that I'm going to use Rhinox hide, and I'm going to use that on his little pouches that he's got on his hip, as well as his weapon holster. As well as these little straps that you'll see on this little red canister on the back of his bike, as well as the clasp that's on the book as well. Next up, I'm going to put the green base coats on all of the screens and any trigger buttons that you might want to do. For that, I'm going to use Caliban Green. It's going to take a couple of coats to get it over the screen particularly, but just thin it down and go over it. You probably want to do about 2 or 3 coats of it as you build it up. And just get to a nice solid base coat for that one. And when it comes to the buttons that are on the control columns, again, like I said before, it's just purely artistic choice. If there's anything you like green, do these green at this point as well. After that, I'm going to do the joints between his armour. For that, I'm going to use Eshin Grey. It's a slightly brownier grey than Mechanica Standard Grey, and I quite like it for this purpose. But if you don't have it, feel free to use Mechanica Standard Grey or any other dark grey, really. If you just look around the model, you'll find them anywhere in between like the elbows and the back of the knees and hips and things like that. After that, I'm going to do these little cables underneath his arm holding the Crosier Side Cannon. And for that, I'm going to use Wild Flesh again. After that, I've decided to do his face. Now, I'm using Kislev flesh here for this one, because if you look at the artwork, you'll see that he's got a bit of a paler skin tone to him. So I'm going to start off paler than I normally would, and then put a wash over that and then highlight from there. And it'll take a few coats to get this to go over nice and smoothly and solid coat over the black. But just thin the paints down, don't worry about it. I think this took about 4 or 5 coats to get it done. But it's a small area, and you can use a hairdryer in between coats to dry it off quicker if you're getting impatient. Then again, if you have a look at the artwork, you'll see this little collar around his neck is a sort of a brassy colour. So for that, I'm going to use Balthasar Gold. And I must say, the more I paint this model and study this original photo, it really does make me appreciate the skill and talent of the original sculptors. These models are just so nice, and I've got to be honest, I do prefer them to the newer stuff. Then I'm going to do the rest of the gold on him. And for that, I'm going to use Vallejo's Rich Gold again. Now remember, this is an alcohol paint, so you do not want to wash your brush out in water. You want to have some isopropyl alcohol for this. I like this paint for this sort of a process simply because it is quite watery and runny, even though it is still very controllable. And it makes doing especially these little details on his shin armour and up around his legs, and there's a couple on his hand as well, a lot easier than it would normally be if you had a thicker paint like any of the GW golds. And there's also the trim on his bike around here. You'll get it around the front mudguard, there's some around the fuel tank, and there's also the trim on the wings that I'm going to do gold that are on the front of his bike. And then almost there, I'm going to put the Evil Sun Scarlet down on his Blood Angel's shoulder pad. Put that straight over the Xandri Dust. Because we discovered in the bike video that Xandri Dust does work out as a very nice base for Evil Sun Scarlet if you want to try and get that nice bright colour. And then finally for the base coats, we're going to do his tyres. And to add a little bit of interest, I'm going to use Corvus Black, which has a sort of a greeny greyish tint to it. And if you leave the Abaddon Black in the deepest part of those tyres, it'll add a difference in shade and it'll just make it stand out that little bit more. Now that we've got the base colours down, we're going to be doing the washes next. For that, I'm going to start with Nuln Oil, which I'm actually going to do over the gold. Because if you look at the picture again, you'll see that the gold's got a sort of a dirtier look to it rather than a brown look for it. And I figured the Nuln Oil would work quite well for this. You're also going to want to pick out any of the other gunmetal areas like the engine housings and chain ups on the book. After that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use contrast paint Black Templar in a couple of coats over the very end of the exhaust pipes. So again, in the picture they look like they're a lot darker than it is. If you read the article underneath it, it states that they were painted up to look quite sooty. So I decided to go with this to darken them up and see if it works quite nicely. You're going to want to do a couple of coats, and you can use a hairdryer in between coats to help dry it out a little bit quicker as well. After that is Agrak's Earthshade, which I'm going to be putting over all of the bony areas except for the alien skull on top of the banner pole. And I'm not going to be putting it on the book that's on the back yet either. So just the front of the bike like that, any of the scroll work that's on there, as well as the brown leather seats that the Chaplain is sat on. There's also on the Chaplain himself his Aquila, as well as the top of his Crozier's Arcanum that wants to be done with this. Next up, I'm going to go to Carroburg Crimson, and that's just going to want to be done on any of the waxed seals that are there. You don't really have to do it on anything else on this, and we're not going to be doing this on the shoulder pauldron either. That's going to be done slightly differently towards the end. You're also, on this, going to want to pick out the little red canister that's on the side of his bike. I'm also going to put this onto the cover of the book that's on the back of his bike as well, and this will give a real nice red tint to that brown. Then it's Queelia Green Shade, which really, actually, the only place this needs to go is the little laurel on the top of his Crozier's Arcanum. It's not needed anywhere else, I don't think. And then for the little power cable under his arm, that's going to be a Athonian Camo Shade. Then for the alien skull, what we're going to do is we're going to use some Agrak's Earthshade to begin with and put that all over this. And just work it around. Don't do it really thickly at all, not by any stretch, but do it maybe a little bit thicker than you normally would, but try and avoid to get any pooling. And then after that, to add the sort of alien look to it, what we're going to do is, whilst the Agrak's Earthshade is still wet, we're going to use some Druchii Violet, and we're going to paint it just onto the little ridges on the front of his skull, as well as in the little dips just on the side of the skull. Add it in, sort of mix it together actually on the skull itself, and it'll add a sort of a purpley tint to it, which will help it add that sort of alien-esque vibe. Then quickly for the headlights, it's just Fugan Orange for that. And then for his face, we're going to do some Reikland Flesh Shade. Again, you don't really want to slop this on, because we want to try and maintain the sort of pale complexion that we're going to be going for. So try and more guide it into the recesses around his cheeks and eyes and anything around his ears or anything. And then finally, to finish off, we're going to do a little recess shade around the shoulder pauldron. And for that, I'm going to use Contrast Paints Wildwood for that. And get the thinnest paintbrush you can. I've got my Army Painter's Masterclass brush for this one. And then just paint it directly into the very edge of the recess. And remember, you don't have to worry about if you make a little bit of a mistake. You can just go in and repaint over it and neaten it up a little bit. So don't break a sweat or anything about getting it absolutely perfect. And also, a good little tip for you is try not to hold your breath when you're doing something like this. If you do that, it increases your heart rate, and that will actually translate through into your fingers. And it'll make it a bit harder to do the thinner straight lines. So try and do nice steady breathing as you're doing thin work like this. And with that, we're finished with the washes. We're ready to move on to the final stage of the highlights, which is really going to complete this model. Now that all the washes are finished with, I'm going to move on to the highlights. And to begin with, I'm going to start with the greens. And for that, I'm going to begin with Warpstone Glow on the screen of the motorbike here. To do that, I'm going to start about a third up the screen and just start glazing it in, layering it in sort of thing, building it up. And it'll go in kind of thin. And as you do that over a few coats, you'll get quite a nice little transition build up as it gets up to a brighter layer. After that, I'm going to use Moot Green. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to pick out some of the top corners of any of the buttons and triggers that you might have done on the handlebars. And then I'm going to do it on the screen again. And for that, I'm just going to do a thin edge of it around the actual edge of the screen. And just carefully do it as you go in. And build up that nice little edge, and that'll give the impression of a nice shiny screen. After that, I'm going to do the laurel on the Crozius Arcanum. And to begin with, I'm going to do Cabalite Green. And I'm just going to pick out the actual leaves of the laurel. And just take my time as I go through picking them out and adding that nice little brighter tone to them. And then to finish the laurel off, I'm going to move up to Sybarite Green and just basically put these on the very tips of the leaves. And then the final green one to do is the cabling underneath his arm. And for that, I'm going to use Lauren Forest to begin with and just sort of flick the brush over the piping that's there, picking out the actual detailing. Don't have to try and be massively neat with this, just flick your brush over it backwards and forwards and you'll pick them out. And then to complete them, I'm going to jump up to Strachan Green and just add a tiny little pinpoint highlight on the cables here. You don't really have to do this, to be honest, but seeing as it's a character model, I'm thinking of going just that little bit further than I normally would. And now it's the reds. And I'm going to start by reapplying Mephiston Red over things like this canister on the back and anywhere else. Just build up the layers of it, reapplying it to add that brightness back to it after you've hit it with the Carroburg Crimson. And then I'm going to go to Evil Sun Scarlet. And I'm going to do that on the edges of any of the switch that you might have done, as well as on the edge of this canister as well. And it's also going to be applied to any of the purity seals that you have around the place. And also, if you turn the model on its edge nice and carefully, you can do the red line into the weapon holster on his hip, if you've done the nice red edge to it. And if you just take your time and pick it out very carefully with your finished brush, you'll get a nice little hint of brightness there. And then it's Wild Rider Red. And that's just a tiny little point highlight on things like the wax seals, the weapons holster, and the canister on the back. And then for the actual left-hand shoulder pauldron, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the finished brush I've got. Again, I'm jumping back to my Masterclass brush from Army Painter. And a good tip for this is to try and follow the line created by the wildwood that's been put on there. Remember, it doesn't matter if you make a little bit of a mistake doing this, you can tidy it up afterwards. So don't fret and don't worry about getting it absolutely perfect first time. And now I'm going to move on to the browns, and I'm going to start with his leather seat. And that's going to be started off with the edge highlight of Scrag Brown. I'm just going to go around all the edges of his leather seat here and just pick that out and add a little bit of texture to it. And then to finish that off, I'm going to jump up to Deathclaw Brown and just add some very final little points of highlight on it, so it looks like it's really been roughed up and damaged by the rider getting on and off it all the time. This is another point of highlight that you don't really have to do unless you really want to. Again, because this is a character model, I'm just going to take these little bit of extra effort just to add that spots of extra detail. Now I'm going to do the darker browns, like his weapon holster and the pouches, as well as the straps that are on his little red canister. For that, I'm going to start off by doing an edge highlight of Gorthor brown. Just again, go nice and carefully around it all, including the little tiny straps that's there. And then to finish that off, I'm going to do a tiny point highlight of Baneblade brown. And this is a step that will also help to add that extra little hint of damage to the leather. And now for the book. And what I'm going to start with is an edge highlight of Doombull brown on there. And that's just a nice little bit of quite a reddy brown colour. And that's just going to start to really help bring out the redness that we've put on there by adding the Carabao Crimson Wash over that Mournfang brown. Just pick out a few spots on it with this. Don't have to go too crazy, all the edges of the book definitely, and if you want to, you can add in any extra scratches and whatnot on the cover bit. And then to finish that off, what I'm going to do is some Tuskor fur. You don't really need a lot of this. This is just, again, to help add that look of damage and roughened upness to the leather of the book where it's been on the back of the bike. And then I'm going to move on to doing the Zandri Dustbone parts of it. So the front of the bike here like this, and any other skulls except the alien skull on top of the flagpole. That one I'm going to start doing is by putting on some Ashapti bone and painting this over most of the areas except for the deepest recesses. And that's also going to apply for the helmet on the back of the bike as well. I'm going to start leaving all the deepest recesses in there, still visible, and then just painting on the Ashapti bone over any of the raised areas and start really accentuating the shape of that skull shape. And then finish off those areas, it's going to be an edge highlight of Screaming Skull. And just carefully pick out the edges of these wings on the front of the bike. If you can, turn the model around so you can try and skim the brush over any of the edges from like a 45-degree angle or something, because that'll make it a lot easier to get a nice thin line. And for the helmet, I'm just going to pick out the edges of the cheeks and things like that, basically highlight it as if it were a skull. Once you've done that, that's these bony areas finished. And the final parts to finish off is the scrolls and the alien skull. And for that, I'm going to start by reapplying Rakarth flesh. For the scrolls, you just put it on there and just reapply it over. And for the Tyrannid's skull that's on top of the flagpole, start filling in, leaving in darker areas again, like the purpley bits and stuff like that. And if you stipple it on again, like I quite like to do, you can start to add that impression of it actually being proper bone. So you don't have to get full coverage with it. Just kind of stipple it on and dot the brush around as randomly as you can and try and start adding in some areas that might look like cracks. And then I'm going to use Pallid Witch Flesh. And I'm going to do that to begin with on the pages of the book. And for this, again, you don't have to pick out each individual page meticulously. Just sort of flick the tip of your brush across them just to get some of the lines in there. And then for the Tyrannid skull on top of the flagpole, do the same stippling sort of motion that we were doing beforehand to highlight it, but cover slightly less area. And if there's any areas that you spot which look like they could be cracks, try and carefully stipple round them with this Pallid Witch Flesh. And that will help to make them just stand out that little bit more and give it that sort of almost natural bone look for you. After that, I'm going to start doing the gold areas for it. And I'm going to go up and do a slightly lighter one. I'm going to do Liberator Gold for this. Just go around the edges of all the gold things, like on the front of the bike and on the trim of it and that lot. And just pick out any of the rivets and just try and skim along the edges of any of the front parts. And just pick them out. Next up, I'm going to do the gunmetal areas, and I'm going to start by reapplying lead belcher to the areas that I've put non-oil over, and just basically overbrush them all and just brighten it back up. You can't actually see a lot of these engine details when the Chaplain's on the bike itself, but it's worth doing this just to bring them up and make them pop a little bit more. And then on the darker bits of the exhaust pipes that I've done, I'm just going to use the lead belcher as an edge highlight around the vent holes in it. And just try and run your brush along the edge of it. Turn the model round so you can try and get your brush in at an angle on there to make it a little bit easier for you. And just take your time and you'll go around, and that'll add help them stand out nicely. And then finally, for the metallic areas, I'm going to use iron breaker. A good little tip for highlighting areas like the tubes on the exhaust pipes here is if you try and angle it so the light's already reflecting off where you want it, and then sort of flick the paint on in little lines and ticking motions like I'm doing here. And when you're doing it, you may not be able to see it particularly well. But once you take it out of the light where it's set where you want it to, it will stand out and you'll actually get the highlights better placed. And I'm also going to do it on the very edge of his shoulder pad here. And this is quite a simple one. Just turn the model around the edge and run your brush along the very edge of it. And do that around the whole of the shoulder pad. And then that will be that part done. And then the final metallic that we are going to do is his brass collar. And for that, I'm going to use Hashot copper. You just go around picking out the corners on that and the little spiky bits. And then for the little bits in between his armour joints, I'm going to start off by doing a line of Mechanica Standard Grey. Just get your finished brush and try and pick these out as carefully as you can. And to finish these off, I'm going to do a tiny little spot highlight of Dawn Stone. This is another one of those steps that you don't really have to do if you don't want to. But since we are going a little bit further with this, it's worth it. And now I'm going to start doing his face. And for that, I'm actually going to start by picking out his eyes and his mouth with some Nuln Oil before I do any highlighting at all. And that'll just help these to stand out for later on when it comes to actually picking them out. And then for the face, I'm going to start by reapplying my Kislev Flesh and just pick out all the details that are there. This sculpt is actually very expressive. It's a very detailed sculpt. So if you just go carefully, thin your paints down a little bit and apply your highlights nice and carefully, you can really bring out the expression on this guy. And a good tip for when you're doing faces is to not highlight the centre of any parts of it. So like you might do the centre of the head, or like you'd normally do a sort of highlight. It's a good idea to work up to the uppermost areas of a face. So like here on the cheeks, what I'm doing is I'm actually working it up so it's to the very top of the cheek, leaning out. Same for the jaw under there, work it up so it gets slightly lighter towards the top rather than the bottom of it. And that actually adds a more natural look to skin tone. And there we have it so far, with just the first layer of highlights doing. That's coming along quite nicely. After that, I then pick out his teeth. And I'm going to use Screaming Skull for this. And just get the thinnest brush you can and just gently and carefully do it. If you remember, if you make a mistake, you can touch up and tidy up at this point because it's only at the first highlighting stage. And now I start trying to do his eyes. Now this is one that is going to be a careful process to do. Remember, like I said earlier, try not to hold your breath when you do it. It'll make it a bit easier to do this. Just steady breathing when you go. And I just use the brightest white I've got, ceramite white, and just go in there carefully. And remember, if you make that little mistake, you can tidy up at this point, so it's not too much of a worry. But just go in there nice and careful. Sometimes like a head magnifier can help for things like this. And then for the final highlight on the skin, I'm going to go up to Flayed One Flesh. I'm just going to cover less area and much more like the higher areas of it. So his head, his brows, the top of his cheekbones. And this will add that final look of paleness to his skin. And there we go. For the pupils, I used a Micron pen again. And like I said before, follow the corners of the mouth to line it up. And I think this looks pretty decent like that. And now we're on to the final highlights. And to start off, I'm going to do the tyres. And for that, I'm going to do Skaven Blight Dinge as just an edge highlight around the grip detailing that's on there. And just work your brush around the edge, turning the model around so you can do it at a nice angle again. You don't necessarily have to go much further than this, really. But this is a stage I would definitely recommend doing for at least a character model. And then finally, we are going to be doing the black armour. For that, I'm going to start off by doing an edge highlight of Thunderhawk Blue. and pick out all of the edges, and where you can, turn the model around again so you can get the brush at a nice angle when you're doing it. And any areas that you can't turn the angle around, just try and do it vertically down and just go as steady as you can. And remember our old mantra, if you make a mistake, it can always be cleaned up, so don't fret too much. Just do the best that you can and take your time. And then to finish this off, we're going to go up to rust grey for a final highlight. And this is just going to be done on the very upper edges of anything. So like the top part of the backpack here, it can also be done on any rivets that are on the model, as well as any of the uppermost edges that you can see on the Chaplain himself. And to finish off, I've actually finally remembered to record me doing some decals. And these are the tweezers I like to use. They're ones that when you're not squeezing them, they are closed and you have to squeeze them to open them. And I find these are very useful for doing that, just like this, so you can basically clip onto the decal paper without having to squeeze it and hold it in place. And before I put the decal down, I'll always hit the area with the decal with some gloss varnish, and I use Micro Sol and Micro Set for this. They're quite common decal chemicals, and I would highly recommend them. They're not the cheapest, but that little pot that I've got there has probably lasted me 3 years, maybe 4, and you can barely tell I've actually used any. So once you've got the decal softened, I like to just apply a fairly decent amount of the Micro Set, that's the one, and put that on first, and then slide the decal on, and you can slide it around and get it into place nicely with that. And when it comes to doing shoulders, the Micro Set does actually soften the decal a bit as well. So if you put some on the decal before you put it on somewhere like a shoulder, it can almost kind of help it to conform to the shape. Because as a lot of people know, getting decals to form to shoulder pads can be an absolute nightmare and they don't like it. So if you use a fair little bit of this Micro Set and put that on there, and it will start to help it, and then let that dry. Now as you can see, once that's set, it's got a fair few wrinkles on there. So what I use afterwards to help get the decal to go down is the Micro Sol. And this stuff is a really good decal softener. You can get other brand names that do the same thing. Some of them are stronger, some of them are weaker. But this is just the same one that goes with the Micro Set. And this is quite good. Put a few coats of this on, do it fairly liberally, but not so much that it's dripping off the model. And sort of press it around as you're doing it. Don't push it and don't squeeze it down. I like to almost use the base of the brush and roll it around like I'm doing here, and sort of roll it over. You can also do this with a cotton bud, but I sometimes find cotton buds can leave a bit of cotton fluff on there, which annoys the living daylights out of me. So do it with the paintbrush, like I said, do it at the base of it and sort of roll it around and help the decal to conform to the actual shape of the shoulder pad. And then, as you can see, once you've hit it with some matte varnish afterwards to seal it in, you can use Lamian Medium or anything like that. I just like matte varnish and I use it through an airbrush to put it in. Once it's in, it flattens them off quite nicely and it helps them all disappear in, especially as you can see on this one here. Like, you can't really tell it's a decal. And so with that, that is actually the decals done, and all that is left is the banner. In the article in the original White Dwarf, you can see that the Chaplain on bikes got this really nice banner done for him. So what I'm going to do is try and do my best to do that one. And to begin with, what I'm starting out with is that sheet of decals that I've scanned again. And I'm going to start with the Dark Angel one, because it's already black. And I've painted it black to darken the colour up, as well as reinforced the edging that I did on last time. And then I've hit it with a gloss varnish over the top. I've done this with an airbrush, so it's gone down nice and smoothly. And then from then, what I'm going to use is a couple of decals. And I'm going to use a skull decal for the freehand skull that we can see. And a good little trick for doing this is you can line it up with the number that's on the Blood Angels one underneath. The other decal that I'm going to use is a white Blood Angel symbol. And just apply that in the same way. And again, I try and line it up with the Blood Angel symbol that's on the banner below it. And then once the decals have dried and set on there properly, I'll go over it with a coat of matte varnish through the airbrush again. This helps to seal the decals on and dull it down a bit. It also helps the paint to adhere to the skull, because we're going to attempt to make this skull look more like the freehand one that's on the banner in the White Dwarf art. To begin with, what I'm going to do is paint over that very carefully with Zandri dust, and just basically colour it in with the thinnest paintbrush you've got with this paint, and do it as gently as you can and as carefully as you can. Turn it round, however you've got to do it to help you get this in line and do it properly. And as you go round, it doesn't matter too much if you make a little bit of a mistake anywhere, because it's just black round it, so you can tidy up with that. And the eyeballs and the nostril and anything else like that, you can go in and tidy up as well if you go over it. And if you just go in nice and carefully, you should be all right. Unfortunately, the rest of the stuff that I recorded painting this, I decided to put my thumb in the way of the camera for the entirety of it, and you couldn't see a thing that I did, which I'm not very pleased about. But what I'll do is I'll say what I did. So I then went over and highlighted it with a Shakti bone and really helped to bring the detail out on it and add some sort of like cracks and effects around it. And then after that, what I did, I went in and I darkened it off with some Agrax Earthshade into the areas where I wanted the recesses. And a good idea when you're doing this is, if you can, have a picture of the original photo up in front of you so you can see what sort of a look you're going for. And then once I'd got all that laid down and done, it was looking pretty good if you ask me, or if I do say so myself. And then from there, I'll then hit it with another coat of satin varnish through my airbrush. Do a couple of coats of this, and the good thing is as well that once it's all finished, you can then hit it with a hairdryer to help it all dry out. And then once it's done, it's looking pretty good and pretty close to the original photo. I'm very pleased with it personally. So then all that's left now is to put it on the bike and do the bases, and then we can go to the final shots. Just before we go to the final reveal, I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching along with me again for another one of the steps in my journey towards October's get-together with Bring and Battle Wargaming. And I really do hope you've enjoyed it, especially the little bit at the beginning where I go into a little bit of an explanation about what I'm hoping to accomplish with this chap. Maybe with the addition of the scythes and the ablative armour, he'll be able to cause some damage and actually survive long enough to get into battle. Or maybe he'll get gloriously gunned down on turn 1, which is quite likely where it comes from me. If you've enjoyed this, consider giving me a subscribe and maybe hitting the bell icon so you get notified. The more people that subscribe, the more people will be able to see these videos. Now with that, let's go for the final reveal. And here is this mighty hero of the Blood Angels Chaplain, ready to guard the face of his brothers and lead them into battle against the enemies of the Imperium, screaming the Emperor's name and their father Sanguinius as they deal death to any who would oppose them. The banner that I've put on here really does help it look like it's jumping straight out of the pages of the White Dwarf. And those extra few little touches of highlights really do add that extra little touch to him. And when he's in amongst his battle brothers, riding into battle, those extra little details, whilst they add that nice little bit of pop, they don't make it stand out too much as though it's had too much more work done to it. And I think he looks perfect as a lovely little centrepiece for it. My force will eventually include an extra 3 Blood Angels on bikes, which are actually the ones which I painted from Richard from Bring and Battle Wargaming already. And thankfully he's been very kind in letting me use them in my force. There'll be a few extra additions to this force which will come up in future videos. So once again, if you hit the bell icon, you'll be notified of them when they come up. And so with that, I would just like to finally say thank you very much for watching another video with me. Stay smiling and keep the old hammer alive.